gonna be a little bit. It's gonna be a little bit of a jog in the beginning, and then it'll turn into a little bit of a sprint for the questions, and it'll get a little bit more challenging, hopefully. And I'm really lucky to be presenting this journal club with Dr. Irvin today on a very timely subject. So we had 3 different required articles. One of them was a clinical trial, and the other 2 were perspective pieces on the COVID-19 vaccine. And also, please feel free to stop me at any time if I'm not making any sense. So yes, we had 2 perspective pieces and 1 clinical trial. So a little bit of background that I'm sure everyone is pretty familiar with. The SARS-CoV-2 infections and resulting disease COVID-19 have spread to millions of persons worldwide. And there are multiple vaccine candidates currently under development, but none of them are available yet in the United States. There are interim safety and immunogenicity data available, and there are multiple perspectives on the needs of phase 3 trials and the speed of approval, the EUAs, and distribution concerns. So first, we're going to talk about the clinical trial and go into the methods and really try to dig into what we really gathered from this trial and how we're going to move forward. So what is generally the primary objective of a phase 1 trial? What are the characteristics of the study participants enrolled in phase 1 trials? So this is generally speaking.
Generally, some sort of very, very basic safety dose finding. See if you can find any sort of risk that would preclude you from going on to a phase 2, where you sort of try and find something that might have benefit of any efficacy before moving on to phase 3. Generally healthy people. You're not really pulling people who have the disease at this point.
Yes, that is very accurate, Riaz. And then, so now we know the general goals of a phase 1 clinical trial. So what is the inclusion and exclusion criteria for this study? Disclaimer, it's on the slide already, but who would like to just kind of reiterate and kind of connect what are the general goals of a phase 1 trial and the patient populations in this phase 1 trial and the patient populations? So in this study, so generally, like Riaz said, phase 1 trials are within healthy individuals and generally healthy young male volunteers. However, in this clinical trial, the population was healthy adults aged 18 to 55 years old and older individuals aged 65 to 85 years old. And as always, there's an extensive exclusion and inclusion criteria, especially at these early phases of these clinical trials in a very controlled environment. So this study was also named to be observer blinded. So what does that mean? And what type of bias does that aim to prevent? And also, what type of bias does randomization aim to prevent?
Iman, you might have to start picking on your colleagues if they're not going to volunteer.
Does that include faculty or only students?
You're certainly welcome to pick on any faculty other than myself.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, I was just about to say faculty are talking too much already, so I think students would be first choice.
Yeah, students should be the first choice.
Okay.
I'm an observer blinded. Go ahead, Lynn.
Oh, sure. Thank you. I think whoever's doing the outcome ascertainment is probably blinded, like with the intervention. And that type of bias, probably information bias. And what type of bias does randomization aim to prevent? Maybe how do we say that? Just confounding. I don't know whether that should be categorized as bias.
A selection, really, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Very good.
Yeah.
Close. So yeah, so masking aims to prevent information bias and randomization aims to prevent selection bias. So only those administering the doses were masked, meaning like the participants and analysts were considered unmasked. Okay, so then let's go into revealing the randomization and dose escalation scheme. So how did they conduct randomization? What was the ratio? What was the dosing regimen? And how did the study team initiate this?
I'm also curious to know what people think about that randomization ratio.
We could even popcorn this. So Lynn, you can choose someone since you just answered this question.
Probably Riaz. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'd say, I mean, obviously the ratio is 4-to-1, but I'm interested about sort of because they just say interactive web-based response technology system, which seems, I mean, it's a big words. It seems to me sort of like maybe some stratified, but they don't really say blocked anywhere, which small sample size and with a bunch of different groups. I'd wonder why. It's sort of difficult to tell if it's exactly like stratified or if it's some sort of adaptive randomization where they're trying to put the characteristics in and then randomize people so that you've got equal distributions that way instead.
And even we both went.
That's not really clear.
Yeah, we both read the protocol as well, and it wasn't even it wasn't clear to us as well, even from the protocol that was attached to the publication.
Why? I have a question for Riaz. Was there anything in the manuscript that made you think that they might have stratified randomization?
Just because the way that first sentence sort of goes in the describing the randomization, we randomly assign trial participants to groups defined according to vaccine candidate dose level and age range. I'm not sure if that is like, if then that means they stratified by, age range, or if that's something that they just included as an element in considering where people were going.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what do you guys think about the repercussions of not clearly laying out the randomization scheme and the method of randomization? I think Mingy's on the call for students. If Allie wants to answer, I know it's a little putting on the spot, or Alexandra.
I'm happy to chime in. Why not? It sounds like it might have had some clustering in their randomization schema. It said there were 4 sites and 2 sites per vaccine candidate. So that was a little unclear to me as well, but just another thought.
Awesome. So yeah, so they just kind of broadly said it was web-based interactive randomization and that they randomly assigned trial participants to groups defined by vaccine candidate, dose level, and age range. And all participants were to receive 2 injections of active vaccine or placebo administered 21 days apart. And the repercussions also can go over to transparency, reproducibility of results, and kind of understanding the possibilities of different, or how selection bias can even creep in when your randomization scheme is not fully clearly laid out.
Can I ask my question about the randomization ratio real quick?
Yes, of course.
So how do you guys feel about 4-to-1, considering that safety was a concern and an outcome in this particular trial? Are there thoughts on that?
In my opinion, it's a double-edged sword, right? You've got your concern is safety. That's your main purpose of the trial, figuring out if it is safe, so you don't really know. But also the more people you assign to it, the more likely you are to find those events, kind of thing, right? If you just went 1-to-1 or 1/2-to-1 or something, you know, you've got more people getting placebo, less actual people exposed. So you're going to have a harder time assessing that safety. So I guess it sort of depends on maybe what the preclinical stuff showed, what the possible events are going to be, whether you would gamble on exposing more people to find more, or, you know, if there was anything really worrisome, you probably wouldn't have progressed to the stage anyways. But if there was something sort of more intermediate, you know, maybe then you'd hedge your bets and go a bit more equal randomization or something.
Yeah. Okay. So then next, we're just going to kind of go over the results and limitations. So the primary outcome was on safety, and the secondary outcome was immunogenicity, and they found that the BNT162b2 was associated with lower incidence and severity of systemic reactions to the other candidate, and particularly in older adults. So just to remind you, the patient population is kind of split into two, 18, I think, to 25, and then 55 to 65. So a younger age group, an older age group. And the phase 1 portion of this trial tested many hypotheses, however, was not powered to make formal statistical comparisons. And the participants in this early stage clinical trial were considered healthy and also had limited racial and ethnic diversity as compared to the general population of individuals experiencing COVID-19. So that kind of just brings me back to the phase 1 limitations of demographic extrapolations. We see that this is majority a white population that is being tested for this vaccine, or for these vaccine candidates. And it's just kind of bridging the gap again with this relevant, I guess, understanding the demographics of the populations that we're evaluating versus the populations that are very affected by this condition disease. And it's really interesting to see. So phase 1, we have limited extrapolations available based on the small sample size and the population of participants. But when we look to the phase 3 demographics, so this was released yesterday, or I think a couple days ago by Pfizer, the demographics look very, very similar to the phase 1 trial. However, the population size has significantly increased. So just kind of wanted to see what you all thought about that.
Well, I have a question, and in the manuscript that we're talking about today, they explicitly left out individuals between the ages of 56 and 65. Is there an explanation for that?
They did that in the briefing documents too for FDA, so I was concerned about that as well.
Some of my closest friends and neighbors are in that age group. But there's no, did they explain that? Anyone aware of that at all?
I couldn't find explanation.
You couldn't find it.
No, there was no explanation.
It's an odd, I mean, it strikes me as somewhat odd, but okay.
But there were additional groups added, like the 12 to 15-year-old range. There were some modifications to the protocol along the way, but that's more so for the phase 2/3 trial, where you'll see a much diverse group in terms of age range that they were added sort of after the fact, correct?
Right.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting to see that the highest risk groups are not really being evaluated, but please correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm not getting that correct. But it seems that that age group is within or 65 and above, but also I think the age range that Dave just mentioned is also very high risk. So,
well, remember, there's a difference between the risk of acquisition and the risk of disease or severe disease. And there's no clear evidence that the high risk for severe disease, the elderly, are at any increased risk for acquisition. Right. What you're here trying to do is prevent acquisition and transmission. So yes, you want to make sure that the elderly are included, but you make sure that they're included because of immunosenescence and the difficulty of people over 65 in having an immunologic response to a new antigenic challenge. And it's important, not because they seem to be more likely to get the disease, but because they're more likely to get bad disease, and therefore we want to make sure it works in that age group.
It's a really good point. Okay, there are no other comments on the demographics. So for the group, what are the factors that led to the decision to advance one candidate to the phase 2/3 trials? What are things that they consider post phase 1?
I can talk about the failure of a phase 1 study is that they never find like any single dose that is safe to proceed. That would be like the trial would stop there.
Yeah.
And also, I think they probably had some clues about the immunogenicity from the phase 1 trials, so that it must have at least looked promising without the statistical test.
Exactly. So the Pfizer document highlighted the immunogenicity and the safety, like you just mentioned, and understanding those safe doses. And they noted 3 big reasons for the final vaccine candidate selection, and it was favorable reactogenicity in both younger and older populations, the NHP challenge studies, to bringing in other studies to kind of look at the associations between the vaccine and populations affected, and then robust immunogenicity in both younger and older populations at the 30 microgram dose level. So establishing the dose, safe dose. So Lynn kind of touched upon this, but this is a bonus question. So what percentage of drugs move past phase 1, and what could influence failure at phase 1? So Lynn said that failure could be not being able to establish a safe dose, but what about the percentage of drugs that move past? It's a little tricky because there's oncology drugs and those also have different percentages, but does anyone want to take a stab at it?
It's been a few years since the drug development course, so this is a wild guess. But I want to say like maybe like 10% or something. Like it's small, but I don't. Yeah, that's where I would guess.
A+ or A-, because it's I think 13% overall. That was very close. Oops. Yeah, so overall, including oncology drugs, 13.8% of drugs move past phase 1. And excluding oncology, 20.9% do. So this is just kind of a breakdown of all the different types of drugs that kind of move from phase 1 to phase 2, from phase 2 to phase 3, and phase 3 to approval. So I think keep this in mind when we're thinking about advancing candidates to the further stages of clinical trials and also to approval.
Well, it does look like that's overall for approval, right? As opposed to, because it looks like you've got around 60% overall moving to phase 2.
Yeah, so wait, I should have been a little bit more clear. So moving from phase 1 to approval.
To approval, yeah, okay.
Yes, yes. But still, you're really close. Good. So moving to the 2 perspective pieces. So the questions I want you to think about is why not approve a drug at phase 1? What are the repercussions? And it seems quite obvious, I think, as you're thinking about it, and I see all the smiles. But let's see, like, okay, so what are the key points from the WHO ad hoc expert group paper? What are they really highlighting? Here are a few of the points, but what did you guys think?
Just at phase 1, you have no idea if it works, or if it's, you don't really have any idea about the drug.
That is very true. And they really highlight median follow-up time and the importance of follow-up time when doing a safety evaluation. Let me see, I'm like looking at the students because someone's going to be called on. So in this paper, they also kind of mentioned what are the ethical concerns for keeping individuals on the placebo arm. They pretty much have suggested that we need the long-term phase 3 clinical trial data, but as many of you know, they're evaluating approval in the next few weeks, and distribution can start occurring in the next, I think, few weeks to the beginning of early next year, for depending on who categorizes as highest need, etc. So what are the ethical concerns that they describe? And what are your thoughts on this?
And also for an AC question, how would you change the protocol in order to accommodate this pending approval? That was literally something that was asked this morning.
Alexandra, Mingy. Do either of you want to take a stab? I feel so bad. But, or faculty, what are your thoughts?
So Iman, it might be important to talk a little bit about what are some of the concerns, the statistical concerns, the protocol concerns, some of the logistical issues that you would have to discuss at the specific phase when it comes to including the placebo or continuing the trial at phase 3 with participants who have been randomized to placebo when we have an emergency use approval of a vaccine that they are actually in the trial participating in. So there are a lot of different questions. So maybe if you introduce some of the issues, and then maybe students can chime in on what they think are some of the ethical concerns.
Yeah, so individuals that are planned to stay within this phase 2 phase 3 trial is expected to be under observation, I think, for 2 to 3 years. So what are the ethical concerns of individuals remaining in the study on the placebo arm when a vaccine has come to market? Is that kind of where you're going with it, Anne? I hope so.
Yes, so many of them will want to be unmasked and maybe receive the vaccine. Maybe some of them may want to receive other vaccines that are not within, they're not the Pfizer approved one. So what are some of the concerns that you have going forward, considering the fact that the intention is to continue following them for at least 24 months past the second dose, if I'm not mistaken. So there are a lot of different concerns. There will be undoubtedly crossover. So how do you handle that?
Yeah. Including protocol adjustments, statistical considerations, also like Teresa mentioned.
And also the ethical considerations. Is it ethical to continue participants on placebo under the emergency use approval? So there are a lot of the different questions we can discuss.
Yeah.
Just as one point, because Teresa mentioned, sort of the thing again that's been going on all day so far, and that point that Anne had about, sort of crossover unintended, perhaps, people going out seeking, if the vaccine were to become approved after the trial's already started, how would you prevent sort of people going out and getting it? And Steve, Dr. Goodman gave a interesting couple ideas. One I hadn't considered before, but sort of keeping it as a blinded crossover once approval happens, which, if there was a broader full sort of approval, and you've got your trial going already, just give everybody in the trial a new dose, a new set of it. Everybody on the placebo arm gets the vaccine, everybody on the vaccine arm gets the placebo, and so you've then, people still don't know what they've got or what they had originally, what they're getting now, but you sort of give everybody the vaccine then. So you'd probably at least you'd prevent people going out and getting it themselves and not necessarily telling you about it.
Other faculty thoughts?
Well, so the biggest issue on keeping people on a placebo arm relates to the risk-benefit calculation. You know, if you're dealing with a potentially fatal disease and you have an effective treatment, you're going to tie yourself up in ethical knots trying not to give them the treatment. And so the big advantage to keeping them on placebo is what you learn. You know, we're going to approve this vaccine presumably with 2 months safety data. What happens, you know, we won't know what's going to happen at 18 months unless we have some data. Now, maybe you can get the 18-month follow-up long-term toxicities we don't know yet about from cohort data, but remember that once you give everybody the treatment, you have no comparison group beyond that moment. And so you can't sort out vaccine-related late problems from disease-related late problems. And so, you know, it's always a risk-benefit calculation, both in terms of the individual patients, but also in terms of the societal knowledge needed. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to take people, once there is an approved vaccine that is being widely distributed, and keep them on a placebo arm. Although one would love to see what the long-term consequences are in a rigorous scientific fashion, I think that the demands for the ethical considerations, you know, and the demands to give them the treatment will outweigh the potential scientific gain, despite the critical need for that scientific information. So that's my 2 cents worth.
Is there room for compromise there in terms of the time limit for keeping them on placebo without offering the active?
Again, it comes down to the consideration of patient safety. I mean, I'd hate to be on the DSMC for this one. I would just hate to be on the DSMC, because you're going to, you know, you're going to have, I wouldn't even know what time frame to choose. I suppose if we had data, and I don't know these data, that every single vaccine-related bad side effect showed up in the first 6 months or first 12 months, and we've never had a history of a vaccine-related bad side effect that showed up after 6 months or 12 months, maybe then I could come up with some compromise, but I don't know of any such data.
Alexandra also pointed out an interesting point in the chat. She's having issues connecting with audio. She was wondering if there would be social consequences, i.e., or e.g. rather, if not vaccinated people are restricted more than vaccinated ones, considering lockdown rules, etc. This would be a huge disadvantage for the placebo patients. So some sort of impact on their day-to-day living.
Yeah.
I think there are some like technical issues involved in this. It can be analogous to having a change of standard of care in some trials. For example, like, do we consider the emergency use authorization as a change of standard care? Like, do we believe that based on some of the EUA, I think a lot of them are based on maybe on phase 1 trial results. Yeah, do we consider that as valid grounds for unmasking the placebo arm patients? And probably not. I think, yeah. But if we have a trial that has gone through all of the phases of a approval process, we probably need to unmask all of the patients and deal after that.
I think.
Yeah, but
no, go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry. But if like individual patient like approach the investigators and ask to be unmasked, we probably always have to have that option open for all of them.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point, because I think with EUA approval, if you want to call it that, I wouldn't be, you know, I wouldn't be so quick, you know, giving something to the placebo arm, just because the criteria are just very different from a real and true approval. But it is actually one of the criticisms of the whole EUA process that it may hamper doing clinical trials, randomizing people to placebo, and also acceptance of study participants, right? When you have something available, what's your incentive to potentially go into a placebo arm? So I think that's a real issue.
It is a real issue, yes. And I should just add, because as many of you know, the New England Journal article came out today, the manuscript with the phase 3 data, and the authors or the investigators note that they believe, there is no way that we can maintain the placebo arm after this vaccine is approved. So I think they have no intentions of retaining the placebo arm in the trial, but they would like to continue following the participants through the 2 years of follow-up.
Right, and this then that this is a race, really. I think this changes the whole ball game here, right? So it's a race, because if you are a manufacturer and you invest all that money, right, you have to be, you can't be half a year late. So and I was thinking about that when I looked at the study population also. I mean, they probably just took who they had readily available.
Yes, very true. And another concern is the fact that half of the data that are being reviewed for approval of the EUA are based on data that are collected at less than 2 months of follow-up with the participants, right? So only 50% have 2 months or more of follow-up. So we really don't have a lot of data that really in supporting the EUA in and of itself. I mean, a lot of numbers, a lot of participants, but right, not long enough follow-up as recommended.
I'd like to ask or raise a related point. If I heard correctly, I thought I heard that some folks thought that the fact that this might get approved under an EUA might make a different assessment for the need to give the placebo arm access to a product, as opposed to if this underwent a full regulatory approval. And if I heard that correctly, I wonder if that should be the case when we're also planning to most likely use the EUA only to encourage the vaccination of 350 million people. If the rationale for using using this in a widespread population is strong enough, then why would we think that changes the rationale for unmasking or giving access to the placebo arm of all people?
Dave, I guess a priori, what I would say is I don't think that the method of approval changes it. I think that the method of approval is indicative of the risk-benefit ratio. If you're talking about a cholesterol drug in young people with no other risk factors for heart disease, you might be willing to continue them on placebo a little bit longer. But when you're talking about a pandemic for which there is mortality and it's a highly contagious disease, that changes the calculus. And the emergency use approval is indicative of that change in the calculus.
Right, I would agree. But just for the small number of people that were given the placebo, why would the mechanism of approval change whether they should be offered a live vaccination? It sounds like the authors have already decided what they think should happen based on what Riaz just said.
I did read in the briefing packet that the company had advocated for allowing the placebo recipients to be among the first to get the actual active vaccine. And so they have stated their preference. And I'm not sure exactly how that plays into distribution under an EUA. I don't know if anyone knows.
Yeah. And I just want to point out, Dave, we have to take the side effects into account, right? Just because somebody gets an EUA based on very short observational time, right, or something gets approved under an EUA mechanism, that doesn't mean we have a safe product here. So that goes back to Doug Jabb's point about the risk-benefit ratio. I think you can have an EUA approval and still a very unclear benefit ratio, cost-benefit ratio.
Yeah.
You can in the generic, but I sure hope that's not what we think here, while we're at the same time advocating widespread use.
Does anyone know if we have followed up those who received the mRNA vaccine for SARS for a longer period of time? Have we followed them for 2 years? Does anyone know, to have that basis for safety?
I don't think so, but if anyone else.
I don't
think I
know,
have-
Theresa. That's a good question.
I mean, this is a new platform, and
Yeah.
safety data is really our big concern here. It
Agreed.
was used previously, and presumably that those studies happened quite a while ago. So I would assume that follow-up had occurred, but I really don't know.
Yeah.
So is anyone besides me old enough to remember the swine flu fiasco?
I'm that old.
Which one?
Well, so if you
Tamiflu
remember,
fiasco.
we had under the Ford administration, we had
Yeah,
swine
yeah.
flu. And when we had the swine flu, they developed a vaccine and they rushed it and they started vaccinating people very rapidly. And it seemed like a good idea until they developed several cases of Guillain-Barré, and they basically halted distribution because they were worried that the swine flu vaccine was inducing Guillain-Barré. Ultimately, a long time later, it came out that the incidence of Guillain-Barré was not increased in recipients of swine flu vaccine versus those who did not receive it. But the absence of long-term safety data meant that the distribution was interrupted because we were uncertain of the safety of the vaccine. Now, swine flu is nothing like COVID-19 in terms of its global distribution and its severity. But it's just a cautionary note of how, when we don't have adequate long-term data, we often make decisions that may or may not be correct based upon sort of uncertain knowledge.
And this ties into a point I wanted to make about the difference between Europe and EMA and the FDA. So in Europe, they have an EUA mechanism as well, but they are much more restrictive. They really encourage a speedy normal process with real trial data, and you cannot have an EUA and not continue your trial. So if I'm informed correctly, then even if you get that, you are obliged to continue with your clinical trials.
But aren't these trial data the same ones being submitted to Europe? So aren't they going to continue anyway?
I don't know how they're going to look at this over there, or if they require further evidence, right? I can't tell, but if you start the process in Europe, at least, you can't just take an EUA type of approval and then stop your trials. You have to continue with your trials, which is which might tie into the problem to find potential study participants.
Yeah. But looking at the study participants, they're all over the world. We have only a fraction that are actually in the United States, could potentially even access the active vaccine. So even administering it to the placebo arm seems feasibly impossible right now.
That's a good point, at least for the non-Americans.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think these are all really, really good points surrounding the ethical concerns and whether the placebo arm will continue to exist, which probably not. But so then there's a few more points, but I think we're supposed to drop off at 1, or is it 1:15?
1:15, 1:20.
Okay, perfect. So the next kind of question and topic is, what are some trade-offs for using a 1-dose regimen versus 2? And this can include implementation challenges and really kind of looking at a 70% versus 90% efficacy. What are the trade-offs? What do you guys think?
So the trade-off issue obviously involves perspective. From the individual patient perspective, you want 90% efficacy. I mean, and if you're clever enough, you'll make sure you show up for your second dose. Now, not everybody's clever enough to do that, but that's really what you want. From a societal perspective, and particularly from a public health perspective, if you cannot adequately administer 2 doses to everybody for whatever logistical reasons, but you could much more effectively administer a single dose to everyone, then you would have a bigger effect on the pandemic. But it's all perspective, in my opinion. Well, it's not all perspective, but it's perspective.
Yeah, just think about a developing country context where the public health system is really challenged. So I could imagine settings where a one-time dose, even that one is very hard to administer, and 2 times might be impossible in certain settings.
So when is AstraZeneca getting theirs done?
Didn't they just have a misdosing issue where I think like half the individuals in their study got half of the dose that they were supposed to?
They did, but even with 1 dose, it was.
Oh,
Well,
no.
so AstraZeneca's problem is more complicated. It's not half, it's a subset got half dose for the first dose and full dose for the second. And that's the group that had the 90% success rate in terms of prevention of acquisition of infection. The full dose, two full doses had a 70% success rate. And so, which is of course a confusing response. And, they're scrambling to figure out how to address that issue. And the half dose apparently was not designed. It was a mistake. And so, and it is difficult to come up with a rationale for why half full should be better than full. But who knows? So I think AstraZeneca has a longer or a harder road to approval just because of the glitches in its study management.
Yeah.
Another consideration that ties into Stefan's point about sort of ability in countries and parts of the world where one might be all you can sort of hope to get easily is cost as well. I know the US doesn't like to do sort of cost benefit analyses as much as a lot of other parts of the world do, but that is a big consideration as well, especially if you're you may not have the ability to buy extra doses if 2 are required. If 2 is more expensive, of course, assuming 2 is more expensive than 1, then you're going to also be wanting that 1 dose is going to be preferable as well. That'll be something you really have to think about.
That's actually why I brought up the AstraZeneca one. It's based on a platform that's already being used for other vaccines. So presumably manufacturing capabilities are in other countries that can be licensed out for that reason.
And I include, I think, a timeline of all of the pipeline and then a pipeline and the timeline of the vaccines that are currently being tested. I can send that to you guys.
Just along the lines of implementation challenges, I can imagine a scenario where the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is far easier to transport and store, and might be only 70 to 75% effective, has an easier implementation in resource poor countries, whereas the somewhat more effective 90+ vaccines like from Pfizer can be adequately administered in richer countries. And just think about the public relations nightmares that could engender. I mean, and it's a very pragmatic issue as to what do you do? Do you use a slightly less effective vaccine that you could get out there and administer to far more people? But then how do you defend that? So, and I don't know that I have the answer, but certainly it's something that whoever is in charge of these sort of implementations, and particularly WHO, will have to address.
Is this a situation of making perfect the enemy of the good, though?
It sure could be.
It's pretty good for a vaccine.
Yeah, I mean, Shariza, it certainly is. But you and I both know that the notion that we are administering an inferior vaccine to resource poor countries is just a public relations nightmare.
Yeah, it's communication.
Is there any, I have no idea about this. This is, you know, a question to anybody who knows. But would there be anything that, say, precludes somebody getting the less effective dose because it's, you know, less effective dose because it's cheaper, easier to administer, quicker to get out there, more feasible, and then later on getting the other vaccine, like as a follow-up, maybe not immediately, but you know, when it's, say, if that were something that could be worked out and sort of maybe one way of addressing that with those countries as that sort of PR communication thing, right? Like, you know, the resources aren't there for everybody to get this one, so we're going to be splitting this up, and everybody getting A is going to also get B later on when we work something out.
Well, setting aside any logistical issues to double dosing, I don't know, 5 billion people, we have no data on the immunogenicity of the second vaccine after the first one has been administered. And with absolutely no data, the possibilities are it's completely ineffective, it's very effective, or it makes people sick or stink.
Or harmful, yeah. Well, that's what I was wondering, if there's any sort of precedent in previous things as well, right? Because there are other diseases with multiple different vaccines out there. Are there any examples?
I think for
people getting different vaccines, we
could look to polio, where people got both the Sabin and then the Salk vaccine, and see what happened in that situation. There might be some data there. I just don't know of it.
So to follow up on Riaz's point, wouldn't there also potentially be an opportunity to dose twice as many people with a single dose of this Pfizer vaccine and then go around and do the second dosing, not after 28 days, but after 3, 4, 5 months?
Mm-hmm.
That's related to the question also that's on the screen.
Yeah.
I don't think we know the efficacy of that second dose if it's delayed by more than 28 days. That's all they studied.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
And to follow up on Sharice's point, I agree with you that maybe we should be concerned with whether we're making the good the enemy, or the perfect the enemy of the good. But if it's good, then it's just as good in the US as it is in any other part of the world. And good is, there's no way to get away from the perception that somehow we're making a tiered system if we reserve the better, quote unquote, better drug or better treatment for certain places. There are no easy answers.
Yeah, I don't know if perfect is really perfect. I mean, we do not have the long-term safety data. That's not going to change anytime soon.
Right, but that would be true for any of the vaccines, not just the better Pfizer vaccine, so-called.
It's a different type of safety, though. This
New platform, yeah. But if people thought that the new platform entailed some additional risk, then you could let the Americans or the rich countries get the one that has the better, well-known safety profile too, you know, and you'd still have the same perception problem.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer.
I'm wondering, like, for a question. So for example, the Moderna 2-dose vaccination, will people study the efficacy if people just get one dose of the 2-dose series?
I think will be hard to study that, won't it? Because there won't be great follow-up on people who are supposed to get the second dose and just don't.
And I'm just thinking about the possibility for example, observational study later on, because people might only in the real world use, people might only get one dose, and that could still have some efficacy.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't know the number.
Yeah, I think that's you know, in my opinion, probably the best case scenario with the getting better safety data as well for these trials that might, with that risk of sort of the placebo group stopping entirely kind of thing. Instead, just convert the trial. You've already got a cohort of people set up, so just follow everybody then under more rigorous data collection, then sort of theirs is going to be catching events, but problems with that data, right? You've already got a cohort developed and protocol set up for following up these people. Why not just, you don't have a 2-arm trial anymore. You've got, well, you do have a 2-arm trial still, but you've got more, and not randomized necessarily for one placebo all the way through, but you've got just a delayed recipient, and you follow it up, let people get it when they want to get it. See what kind of data you get out of that after a couple of years of follow-up. Presumably that data would be better than what you get just from stopping it and letting everybody go to the public.
That would be good, but would it be hard for the sponsor here to actively pursue follow-up data collection without actively offering the active treatment?
Well, I think that's the plan, is to offer it within the trial, right?
Right. But I think Riaz is suggesting perhaps following them in the hopes that some of them won't get the active vaccine.
No, I mean, theory, maybe, but I mean, even if all of them get it, I'm thinking more of just a better assessment of safety, because you've got them already and you're just telling them, you're in the study, you can leave if you want, but we're going to follow up with you to see safety issues potentially, as opposed to just letting them go out and have them, contact fairs if they experience something on their own.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'm thinking about Dave's point about dosing just once with the Pfizer. I don't know if you guys had a chance to look at the briefing document, but the safety events that came up were a little bit skewed towards that second dosing and after that second dosing. So it's also worth considering with that approach.
Sure, but one of the questions I think is, it's hard to know for sure that it's related to the second dose, as opposed to it just takes 28 days or 40 days
Good point.
to develop. I mean, most of the effects seemed pretty well constrained to short-term vaccination kinds of side effects, but.
Yeah.
And I think I should just point out the other issue in terms of implementation is the issue with the cold storage, right? And the requirement to have dry ice and have it at a certain temperature. And I think in the New England Journal paper, the investigators also mentioned that there's possibility that there will be a subsequent report that they may be able to alleviate some of that concern with cold storage. So that's good news going forward.
I had heard that the German company that partnered with Pfizer was relatively inexperienced at this development stuff. This is stuff that the Department of Medicine put out in an update last week here at Hopkins. And that if they had partnered with Pfizer earlier, they would have been able to do the proper approach and studies. That Pfizer is confident that this can be developed in a way that doesn't require the cold storage, but they didn't have time to meet the regulatory demands to show that, because the German company had started along a path that required the cold storage. I thought that was very interesting. One of the very practical things you would never think of.
Okay, so I think I have a few slides left that I think we can run through pretty quickly, just being cognizant of time. So I think a lot has been mentioned about the EUA and what that status means for the COVID-19 vaccine approval processes. But a question, I guess, to think about is, how much follow-up data was collected for the phase 3 trial? What are the pros and cons for this small time window? And what does that really compare to general vaccine approval processes? Are we undermining safety or the ability to assess safety because of this inherent need and emergency for a vaccine?
Well, I mean, I'll just start with the simple statement that it's all about risk-benefit calculus. It really is. If we were dealing with something far less severe, something far less widespread, we'd want more safety data. I think it's very clear. But we're in an unprecedented pandemic, at least in modern times, and with an ability to short circuit that pandemic. And so you have a very different risk benefit calculus, then you might in a different situation. And, you know, stuff is what it is. But maybe people should weigh in about what they think about how that calculus alters it, or how the situation alters the calculus.
Mingy, Hallie, Alexandra, faculty, thoughts?
I thought Riaz's point about almost a pragmatic approach in following individuals was interesting, and it kind of reminded me of what was stated in the WHO document, where they basically endorsed the simple trial, where since there's a limited amount of dosing, could it be administered in active versus placebo in large scale? So I thought that was an interesting concept as well.
Yeah, so I think back to what Dr. Jabs mentioned, it's unprecedented time. So I guess allowing this median follow-up period of 2 months versus the normal 6 months could be justified. So I think this is the last point. Yeah, so this is the last topic point, which is if you looked at the briefing document, they actually expanded their patient population to adolescents, so 12 years and up. And what could this possibly mean for schools? You know, school reopenings are kind of occurring, and I guess, yeah, so what are your thoughts?
So this is a question for Stefan.
Why? Because I have school-age kids?
Because you have school-age kids.
Or I should go to school again.
No, this is because you, like many people right now, are affected by the issues related to school. And so, you know, we ought to get a concerned consumer within an informed opinion to comment.
Yeah. So the concerned consumer in me thinks that's generally a good idea to test it in that population. I think what they do is probably also, you know, they're expanding the potential market for the whole thing. I mean, and I mean, I can't blame them. This is an important population. School kids bring it into the families and all that. So and you know, it's an important market. So I think it's reasonable to test that population. I wonder why 12, but that might be just some convention, I guess. Maybe Shariza, would you know why you would start at 12 years and not at, say, 10 or something like this?
From my understanding, it's not even that they're starting at 12. They're gradually lowering the age limit as they're recruiting.
They're going down. Okay.
Exactly.
They're gonna
So they're making their way down to 2-year-olds, but this
Yes.
is the chunk right now.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a phased-in approach, right, in terms of recruiting younger participants.
Yeah, because from my specific perspective, they should be testing this in 6- and 9-year-olds. That's my opinion.
But
A 2-to-1 ratio, right?
That's true.
but everybody should remember, it's pretty easy to move a trial from adults into adolescents, because the physiology of adolescence is close enough to that of adults that you tend to get less pushback on that move. Moving it into children under 12 years and under is a much more difficult task. And so, you know, I think about dealing with IRBs and review processes and so forth. I almost always, we include adolescents, and it's pretty straightforward. But once you go below adolescence, unless it's a disease of children only, you get so much pushback. You almost invariably make it a separate IRB application. So I just recognize moving it into adolescence, I think, is not that big a step. Moving it below adolescence is a bigger step.
I should just add that there are already studies that are planned for, as we said, children younger than 12, as well as pregnant women and immunocompromised. So these are already in process, so they will happen.
So if I could just, 11 minutes ago, the School of Medicine sent out a survey to people on their mailing list asking if people were going to get the vaccine. I wonder what this educated group thinks. They had a number of questions, not just are you going to get it, but are people here going to get it as soon as they can? Wow.
So what I would
Yeah,
what I would say, sorry, is I don't think that anybody who's a frontline worker in terms of healthcare and is seeing patients is going to have a choice. I think they're going to be required to get it, and just like we were required to get flu vaccine this year. And if you didn't get flu vaccine, you were barred from seeing patients.
Yeah, most of the people on this call are probably not in that category, though. And so the questions on the survey from the School of Medicine are, I would take it now, I would take it, but I'd like to wait until I see more evidence in the general public. So I see several people nodding their heads now. It's like we all want someone else to be the subsequent guinea pig before we get it.
I've always said since this whole process started that I want to see 6 months of safety data. So if my time comes up when 6 months have passed, then I'll be fine.
Yeah, I think I'm in the same boat, and also just general safety. This was one point that I'm surprised didn't come up in the journal club, but just time. I mean, so. But for a trial that the primary purpose was safety, I didn't think they did a very good job of actually reporting safety.
Mhm.
I mean, they reported a very small few select adverse events that they said were related to the vaccine that occurred in some of them 50% or more participants, and then not as much in the placebo group. But I didn't actually see any selection criteria for how they chose the events to report. And the supplementary appendix only has like a few more. It doesn't have very much at all. Nothing posted on ct.gov yet for results. So I mean, it would have been nice to see something more about what other kinds of events and just even how they selected these ones for reporting, because I didn't see that.
I think you're right, Riaz. As I read this, I was thinking, what might the role of the New England Journal be? They can be a little bit heavy-handed. Maybe they wanted to push the immunogenicity a little bit, but I have no first hand knowledge on this.
Well, of interest, the School of Medicine also asked you to rate how influential various mechanisms would be. And one of them was, I trust Dr. Fauci.
I mean, I do, but that wouldn't be.
Right. I was going to initially say, if Stefan gets it, then I'll get it. But if I have a choice, I'd rather trust Dr. Fauci, no offense.
What does Fauci say?
He said he's getting it. More importantly, he said he's going to try to get his kids to get it too. That's the real proof of the pudding, is that, if he has a spouse and kids get it.
Okay.
Just also in the last second, I'm going to send in the chat. I'm posting a link because it's still ongoing. It looks like Pfizer right now should be giving their talk, their presentation to the FDA, and then FDA has sort of a presentation of their notes. But it's sort of been going on all day. You can join on the website or just the YouTube link itself. There's live streaming it there. I'm going to switch over now and watch that again for the next couple hours, see what sort of ends up happening. They're making basically the decision on this whole thing we've been talking about. So anyone who's interested.
Interesting, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That's great.
Thanks, Riaz. So I also have, I guess, the timeline for COVID, the timeline of all the different or primary vaccine candidates in here. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us today for this journal club and our guest, Allie. And I'll see you all hopefully on Monday for the RIP. Hope you are not sick of me yet. But yeah, so thank you, everyone. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Good to see everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
All right, take care.
Bye all.
Take care.